All right, my clock says 11, and we have a lot of content to get through today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, and welcome to Raymond's Future Proof Your Organization Strategies for Uncertain Times. I am Erin Trask, a principal with Raymond's Public Sector Solutions team, and I'm going to be your moderator today. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping items. Our webinar today qualifies for 1 hour of continuing professional education, or CPE, and for HR professionals, HRCI and SHRM. If you are interested in receiving CPE for today's program, you will need to respond to 4 polls during the live webinar. All polling responses will be kept private. Participants requesting CPE credit will receive a certificate via email within 7 to 10 business days. For those receiving HR credits, that information will be given at the end of the webinar. Today's program is being recorded, and a link to that recording, along with the slide deck, will be sent to all registered participants within 24 hours. Now, I'm happy to introduce today's panel. We have Corrine Conley with our Public Sector HR Solutions Group, along with Michelle Hodges and Rachel Friesch from our Public Sector Solutions Group. Ladies, thank you for taking the time to share your insights with us today. Let's kick it off with leading through uncertainty with Corrine.
Thank you, Erin. And thank you everyone for joining us today. In times of uncertainty, organizations that succeed are not just reacting, but they're thinking ahead and strengthening their strategies for what comes next. Today's session is really designed to give you some practical insight, a few meaningful takeaways you can bring back to your organization, and whether it is refining your approach, supporting your teams more effectively, or identifying areas of risk and opportunity, our goal is that you leave with something that can help you move forward with greater clarity and confidence. So if you walk away today with even one idea that challenges your thinking or improves how you operate, then we will have accomplished what we set out to do today. So uncertainty right now is no longer something that we prepare for someday. This is something that is constant. We see it happening all the time. I want to start with a question. Think about the last time something unexpected hit your organization. Maybe it was a staffing crisis, a policy change that came without any warning. Maybe it was just out of the blue. How about a lack of funding or funding that was taken away or put on hold for a while, or a situation where a staff member had an issue and it escalated in a way that you didn't see coming? Any of that sound familiar? Now think about your first instinct in the moment. Was it to gather information and respond calmly, or was it to react? Reassure and try to put out the fire as fast as possible. Most of us, including myself, might have defaulted to the reaction. Address it immediately. Let's see what we can do. Because in mission-driven work, essentially, we are wired that way. We got into this work to solve problems, to help people that we serve, and to make things happen. Waiting just doesn't seem right. So when you start that process, really, we're looking at how do we prepare and handle things maybe a little bit differently. How do we get through the disruptions the best way? And it's not always to react the fastest. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next several slides. We'll go to the next slide, Erin. So what's the difference? We have 2 columns here, the gap between the organizations. Really, we have those that are reactive organizations and those that are prepared. The gap between the organizations isn't its resources. It truly is its preparation. The slide looks simple, and it is, and it's on purpose. Reactive is to the left, prepared to the right. But if we're looking at it and being honest, we usually fall somewhere in between. If you are looking at it with, gosh, I wish I were in that category, better to realign yourself with where you are today. And then how do we make the improvements to get somewhere different in the future? So reactive organizations, they wait, They wait, they respond late, they operate in silos, where the prepared organization has already planned ahead, responded with clarity, alignment across functions. And most organizations, as I said, fall somewhere in between. Most nonprofit or public sector organizations lean to the reactive, not because people don't care, but because the bandwidth is always stretched thin. The mission always feels more urgent than the infrastructure and the planning for things that haven't yet happened. So here's what I want you to do. Think about this. In a profit or for-profit world, when companies fail to prepare, something goes wrong, they lose money, they regroup, they rebuild, and away they go. In nonprofit agencies or public sector, when something goes wrong, because organizations weren't prepared, real people lose services, the vulnerable people, the exact people that we exist to serve. So the stakes of being reactive in a mission-driven work is it is not just organizational, but it's human. And that's what makes it even more difficult. Can you forward to the next one? The next slide. This slide is the current situation. Really, there are a lot of things that are going on, four things that are happening. Obviously, there are regulatory and enforcement activities that are increased. I'm going to get into ICE a little bit in the next couple of slides that'll help prepare you for some of those activities. We see that workforce uncertainty, the shifting in expectations. Your employees are watching the news. They're worried about policies. They're worried about funding. Do they have job security? It's an unsteady state for the most part. And so there's a lot going on with the employees and the environment in which they work in. Leadership visibility is an all-time high. In a world where every employee has a smartphone and an opinion, how do you lead a crisis and still be seen in those types of environment? Different than what we may have worked with several years ago. And fourth, the one I really want to sit in is risk is interconnected. Compliance, people, culture are not separate issues. They all fold into one another. So most organizations manage in buckets, right? HR handles people stuff, legal handles compliance, and leadership handles the reputation. In this changing world, we will see that can't always be the case, and you'll see how interdependent they are. So I'm going to move to the I-9s here in just a minute, so we can talk a little bit. How do we to get into a situation where so many people are impacted? It will certainly share the magnitude of how things can happen if we aren't well prepared. If you move to the next one, to the LEAD framework, this framework brings structure and certainty. There are four components when we talk about leading in this environment. Is legal readiness. Are we prepared with what we need to legally support us? Are our people connected, focused? Do they trust leadership? Are they engaged? Are roles and responsibilities well defined? Are they accountable? And then are we creating environments where our employees feel are they psychologically safe? And do they feel that security within the organization? That really becomes your defense. So today we're really going to lead into the readiness and the engagement pieces, which will be coming up next. Oops. Hold on just a second. The next one I want to get into is if we look at ICE. ICE is, I thought, a really good example of what people are seeing in the news. We've seen ICE in a lot of different ways than we may have seen previously. We knew it existed, but they're front and center in a lot of different ways. And the way that they are approaching things is different than they would have been before. So let me paint the picture for you. Tuesday morning, a social services agency, let's call it a mid-sized nonprofit, makes a visit to an organization. They're greeted by a lovely receptionist who's been with the organization for about 8 months, doing the best she can. She greets the individuals, and then she starts down this process. The instinct is to help. She lets them in. She starts pulling people. She calls supervisors who don't know what to do. They call HR, who's in a meeting. They call legal, who they haven't talked to for years. 30 minutes later, they're They've cooperated with things that they didn't have to cooperate with. They created a paper trail that they certainly didn't intend to create, and the CEO is finding out what happened real time. Probably not the situation we want to be in, correct? So let's talk about how do we better address those types of things. So if you go to the next one, the things that we look at here are how do we position ourselves better? Let's get specific. Your primary legal exposure to ICE visits is really in your I-9 records. And just as late as March, we received more information. They are continuing to regulate things differently, where things might have been minor clerical components. They're looking at those really as some of those long list of items that are now carry with them fines, which we didn't see before. So being very careful is important. So where organizations are strong, they have centralized ownership, they complete and accurate records. And that means every single form, every single box is filled out correctly and on time. Timely work authorization updates, making sure that you're tracking expirations for re-verification prior to them lapsing, and then compliant and electronic storage. If you have those, your systems typically will meet your federal standards. Here's what organizations get exposed. They're missing incomplete forms. They're inconsistent in processes. Have people left the organization? Is somebody else doing it? Have we updated the forms we're using? And one of the ones that is interesting is overconfidence in your internal controls. So the best practice really is to take a hard look, to be structured in your reviews, to make sure that you have looked at each of the components of your documentation and make sure that you are solid and that you are moving in the right direction. The next readiness is, this is just in documentation. I won't go over it. Similarly to the last slide, making sure that you have the proper information, but train people. There could be not more emphasis put on making sure that people are trained on how to comply with the I-9, but trained on what to do when ICE may show up at the door. Who's responsible for what components? Who's going to be the first person to talk to? How are you going to navigate that and train the employees within the organization so that they're not surprised when ICE shows up one day? The preparedness planning, again, this is if the ICE visits, a strong plan will typically have, it's well prepared in the organization. The front desk knows how to respond. They know what they're supposed to be doing. They have step-by-step protocols, roles and responsibilities across the organization are well laid out, and the level of cooperation and legal boundaries are well defined. That 10-minute window is trainable, it's coachable, but only if you work at it before you need to. If you try to do it afterwards, your 10 minutes is gone, and where are you, right? So make sure that you have taken into consideration these steps to ensure that you're ready should you ever be in the situation that ICE shows up. The next item we're going to talk about, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. There's a lot of detail in here. The proactive steps to handle that. Ooh. And we have a polling question that has appeared on this panel. So the polling question is how confident are you in your I-9 compliance? And there are 4 options from which you can choose. And we would ask that you do complete this and not what you think it is, but take the real approach as to look hard and deep at what you may be doing and how prepared are you? I can't move this one. I guess we have to wait for it.
You can keep going, Corinne. Do you need me to go back
Oh,
to the
no,
previous slide?
okay. Nope, you're good. I think that one I just wanted to make sure that it's in here. People will get a copy of the slides. It just adds a lot of information, more than we probably have time to talk through today, but I think it's important. And really, it's about preparing your organization and making sure people are comfortable with what's going on. The next part that we wanted to talk about really is is the organization and its culture, its employee engagement, things that prepare you for the future, right? That's what we're foolproofing for the future. The key in that is really, if we're going to build organizations that are prepared, organizations that people feel safe and comfortable working within, and where employees feel safe in making decisions and coming to management, and really engaging employees throughout the organization. And I won't spend a lot of time on this. We see it quite frequently. 70% of the employee engagement in your organizations are really driven by managers. Having managers engaged, having them connected, having them have good conversations with their employees. And really, it is the huge opportunity to invest in those managers in the organization. This slide, there's the next three, are probably have a lot of information on them too, really because they're great takeaways for you. But you can see in environments where there is uncertainty, it has a negative impact on the employees. You see that stress will increase. You see that anxiety goes up. And then it's maybe a little less obvious sometimes in some organizations, but people don't take this job for the money. When we look at public sector agencies, they took it for the mission. And when the mission itself feels threatened by funding uncertainty or policy changes or external scrutiny, it hits differently. It hits hard. And it doesn't just feel like job insecurity. It feels like the purpose of what they're doing is being undermined. And so we think about things just a little bit different when we take those into consideration. So it's important to stay aware and to look for those signs where you see people are struggling or where you might find them less engaged. We have increased absenteeism, sarcasm, rumor mills. People are asking fewer questions. If you haven't provided an environment where talk about psychological safety, where people are able to question what's happening, where they have an ability to be direct and gain information when it isn't just obviously readily available, to understand and to see clarity, is important that an environment is created that will support actions like that from employees, especially in those uncertain times of not knowing the answers. And we don't always have the answers as leaders, but communication to employees on a regular and reoccurring basis and being willing to both listen and answer questions can certainly help move things in the right direction. The next is really to provide practical methods to keep employees focused, and what warning signs are, connecting daily and personally with each employee, regularly clarifying their work expectations. It's important for them to know not only what they're supposed to do, and it's not about just reminding them, but it reminds them that they're valuable in this organization. Meeting weekly or on some frequency to meet with employees certainly makes them feel better connected to the organization. And it doesn't take much. If you have a team of 5 people and you reach out every day just to say, hi, how are you? How can I help you? Goes a long way. It doesn't take very long, but it is an intentional effort to let people know that you're there and that you care, especially if you're in a virtual world where you may not see somebody day to day. That continued connectivity is really important. And here again, highlighted the connection between clear communications and high retention rates. Those clear communications establish a trust, clarity, and safety. It helps to engage employees and confident, that gains the emotional commitment, and certainly the higher retention. In a world where we struggle to find people, it certainly could not be more helpful than to find ways to retain the employees that we have while we recruit those to fill in behind us. The next slide, really, organizations that see the greatest impact are those that are intentional in supporting their managers. The framework isn't a corporate concept. It's dressed up in 4 letters that I said earlier about leading. It's a description of what good leadership actually does. And as always, it's sometimes doing the hard things. So I encourage each of you to take those steps to talk to your employees, to connect with them, to make sure that they feel valued and important. And a lot of times we think it's very natural that people know how to recognize their employees. We assume that all employees want to be recognized in the same way. That is not always intuitive for people to think that think to recognize people. We're quick to make sure we correct issues, but reaching out and making sure that people know when they've done a good job, or that you're there to support them or help them grow and develop in ways that are important to them, are also important. So uh, each of those can help move your organization forward, and certainly help you in the future. The next question is a polling question. And it says, when was your last employee engagement survey? You may or may not have had an employee engagement survey, which will obviously be here. Sometimes you may do internal surveys just to determine when something's gone wrong. Maybe it's a fragment of a survey. But really, if you're looking hardcore about how connected are your employees to your organization, and do you really know where the opportunities are for you to improve? Even going the step of asking the question can be very powerful for the employees. They feel like they have a place to express their concerns, and certainly feel that the organization cares about what they think.
Thank you, Corrine. We'll give everyone some time to answer that question while we transition to the next section. Um, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about adapting to legislative changes. And Michelle, I'm going to let you take over from here.
Thank you, Erin. Good morning, everyone. I want to take a few minutes to talk about how minimum wage laws are affecting public sector organizations. As you know, minimum wage is dictated at the state level as long as the state's rate exceeds the federal floor. Statutory increases and inflation-based adjustments continue to move wages upward year after year. While these changes are designed to support workers, they also create significant financial and operational challenges for public sector employers. Across the country, 19 states raised their minimum wage in 2026, and Michigan, Ohio, and Florida were among those 19. These are putting measurable pressure on public sector entities because so much of the work we do relies on hourly labor. The first and most immediate impact, of course, is on personnel costs. When minimum wage rises, employers must increase pay for entry-level positions. But because our pay structures are typically tiered and formula-driven, raising the bottom rung doesn't stop there. It forces wage compression adjustments across multiple levels. So it impacts supervisors, senior staff, other skilled positions. They all need to be adjusted to maintain appropriate differentials. As a result, the total payroll impact is significantly larger than the minimum wage increase itself. Rachel in our next section is going to get into more detail on budgeting, but it's important to acknowledge that even phased in wage increases create budget volatility. Budgets often don't have the flexibility of private sector pricing. When costs rise, organizations often have to reallocate funds from other priorities, potentially delay projects or reduce discretionary spending just to stay balanced. And the impact isn't just limited to payroll. Minimum wage changes trigger a cascade of administrative and compliance requirements as well. Public sector organizations may need to update pay schedules, renegotiate union contracts, adjust grant budgets, and revise internal control and payroll systems as well. One of the most challenging areas is the effect on grant-funded programs. Many programs, especially in human services, housing, public health, they're funded by fixed federal or state grants. When wages rise, but grant funding does not, agencies are forced to make difficult decisions. May need to reduce service hours, serve fewer clients, or shift costs to the general fund or other unrestricted funding sources. These are certainly tough trade-offs, especially for programs already operating with limited resources. But it is important to recognize that higher wages can bring benefits, certainly. They improve worker stability, reduce turnover, and strengthen recruitment. These are all positive things, of course, but they also increase the cost of delivering these essential public services. Uh, it's really reshaping the entire cost structure. Um, The next thing I do want to touch on for our Michigan-based organizations, I know there's at least a subset of folks attending today who are impacted by the direct care worker laws here in Michigan. As many of you know, Michigan has implemented a series of wage pass-through requirements designed to increase compensation for direct care workers in Medicaid-funded programs. These increase apply to eligible workers in settings such as nursing care facilities, adult foster care homes, home health programs, other long-term care and community-based services supported by Medicaid. Michigan, like many states, is facing severe workforce shortage in direct care. These workers provide essential hands-on support to some of our most vulnerable residents, older adults, individuals with disabilities, and people who rely on long-term services and supports. Increasing wages is meant to stabilize this workforce, reduce turnover, and improve continuity of care. While this goal is important, the implementation carries significant implications for provider organizations, including cost pressures and administrative complexity. Even though the state provides additional Medicaid funding to cover these mandated increases, the reimbursement rarely captures the full cost of the increase. It may cover the wage, but not the true implicit cost. Providers must account for payroll taxes, overtime, shift differentials, and there's various ripple effects to other wage tiers. So again, that compression that we're seeing with wages. Just like minimum wage increases, it's just really forcing those adjustments across the entire structure to avoid that compression. I know some of the ladies on the panel today see this in the real world. Does anyone else have any comments you'd like to add on this topic?
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, this is something I work with very closely with the organizations that I support, and it's just been really helpful to partner with Corrine and her team to have some strategic planning conversations. We know a lot of the minimum wage increases that are coming, and so being able to sit down and, as Corrine was talking about, be proactive and plan ahead and think about how is this going to impact our entire wage scale and work through those things, make budgetary allocations so that we can be strategic in supporting our workers and try to minimize the impact on other parts of the organization.
Thank you. So it's important to approach these wage changes with a comprehensive strategy, one that considers financial planning, workforce management, compliance, and long-term stability, and finding the balance between those, which is always the challenge. Move forward. All right. In 2025, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act extension was signed into law. People refer to this as one big beautiful bill, OB3, called many different names, but essentially it did impact tax laws and other various things. So I want to touch on a few of those changes that are impacting our not-for-profit organizations. So, excuse me. So really, it's important to understand how these changes are influencing the behavior of corporate donors and in turn, the financial landscape for not-for-profit organizations. So for many corporations, charitable giving is closely tied to the structure of the federal tax code, of course. When tax laws change, the incentives and financial calculations behind corporate philanthropy change with them. The 25 tax package introduced several adjustments that directly affect how companies think about charitable contributions. Many of the details are listed here, but I'm just going to go over, the overarching approach I see is, first, tax law modified corporate tax rates and deductions in ways that influence the after-tax cost of giving. When corporate tax liability shifts, so does the value of those charitable deductions to the organization. Simply put, For some companies, the deduction is now worth slightly less than before, which can reduce the financial incentive to give at prior levels. For others, though, the stability created by extending certain tax provisions has allowed them to maintain or even expand their giving strategies and plan accordingly. Overall, though, I would say the environment is more cautious and companies are evaluating contributions with greater scrutiny. Another thing I want to add is the law reinforced broader trend in corporate behavior, like a shift to more strategic, impact-driven philanthropy. Corporations are increasingly directing their giving to programs that align with their business priorities, workforce needs, and community-based goals. So as nonprofits are able to demonstrate measurable outcomes and align with those goals, they're seeing benefit there. But that's a bit of a shift. I think the environment's been shifting that way for a long time, but I think there's just more emphasis on it now. I also, yeah, we can move to individual donors. Okay. So the changes to the tax law provision related to individual donors, of course, also impacts their behavior and how they're going to give to not-for-profit organizations. You know, these individual donors are the backbone of charitable giving for so many not-for-profit organizations. Individual giving is certainly connected to the tax structure, the structure of the tax code. When the laws change, these incentives for charitable contributions shift. The tax law modified key provisions related to itemized deductions. For many households, the standard deduction remains high, which means that fewer taxpayers itemize. And when fewer people itemize, fewer people receive a direct tax benefit for charitable contributions. This doesn't eliminate individual generosity, but it does change the gift planning for many donors. Some individuals may consolidate their giving into specific years so that it pushes them to a level where itemizing might make more sense. This is also often called bunching, while others may reduce the frequency or size of their contributions. So could have some negative impacts as well. But the law affects after-tax value of charitable gifts. When tax rates or deductions rules shift, the financial benefit of giving can become smaller for some donors. So like I was saying, those who do not itemize, they're not seeing the benefit of charitable giving. For high-income individuals, changes to deduction limits or phase-outs can influence how much they choose to give in a certain year. Go to the next slide, please. The next couple provisions I want to discuss are pretty limited population that it's impacting, but it's a big impact to those populations that it does impact. So I do want to touch on them. The university endowment excise tax applies to certain private universities with large endowments. And while it affects a relatively small number of institutions, it's significant implications. It reduces the net return on endowment earnings, which in turn limits the resources available for scholarships, resources, faculty support, student services, everything that those endowments would support at the universities. So for universities that rely heavily on endowment income to fund long-term commitments, even a modest reduction in annual returns can create real pressure. Next slide, please. Thank you. Executive compensation. Again, this is pretty limited population, and I don't know that we have any participants whose organization would be impacted, but I certainly want to mention it. And if it does impact you, we're happy to provide some more information and on this topic. But the last provision of the law that I want to touch on briefly is the not-for-profit executive compensation excise tax. So this impacts tax-exempt orgs that pay more than $1 million in compensation to their highest earning executives. While only a subset of not-for-profits fall into this category, the effects are meaningful to organizations directly subject to the tax, of course, from a financial standpoint, but also, from policies and recruitment standpoint, and it really requires boards to take a step back and think about how they're recruiting leadership teams and evaluating pay structures a bit more carefully. With that, we have polling question number 3.
How familiar is your organization with recent legislative changes and their potential impact on operations? So we'll give people a couple minutes to respond to that. Michelle, thank you for highlighting just how important some of being on top of these changes are and some of the major impacts that legislative changes can have on your organization. I think we're going to turn things over to Rachel to bring us home, talking about budgeting in uncertain times.
Thanks, Erin. I appreciate the introduction. So we're going to move into budgeting in uncertain times. And sometimes it feels like it's always a bit of an uncertain time when it comes to our budgets. But in particular, it seems like these days are more uncertain than ever. So we wanted to make sure we highlighted a lot of great information for you today. Beginning with our first slide, in addition to the clear advantages that a strong budget can have on an organization's day-to-day monitoring, budgets are an effective management tool from an organization-wide big picture perspective. And this slide kind of boils down those factors into 4 main areas that we'll discuss briefly. First, internal control. So budgets are an integral part of an internal control structure. They help us establish those clear spending limits and define accountability. They also ensure our public resources are used appropriately and spent wisely. And additionally, budget to actual comparisons serve as an internal control by enabling us to have that routine monitoring of our financial activity. It also, moving on, helps us to identify challenge areas. For example, every time we review our budget, those reports are designed to highlight those gaps between planned and actual performance and highlight areas of potential risk or operational inefficiencies, declining revenues, rising costs, those types of challenges that we want to detect early so we can intervene effectively. Budget amendments remind us that budgets are living documents. They're not meant to be static. Amendments allow us to react proactively in response to emerging and evolving situations throughout the course of our year so we can keep our budget relevant and timely throughout the entirety of your year. And last but not least, from a strategic planning perspective, budgets set the stage for the year to come. They help us translate our long-term goals into actionable resource allocations. They help us prioritize our program goals, our overall policy objectives, and help us to highlight our community outcomes. Erin, if we could move to the next slide. So what are some proactive, actionable steps that we can take to manage uncertainty? Beginning with funding streams. How do we manage our funding streams? The first step really is quite simple, and that is, let's gain an understanding. And we do that by creating a comprehensive list of all of your organization's revenue streams. Make sure we understand exactly what type of funding we have coming into our organization. Once that list is created, moving on to step 2, and that becomes a little bit more involved. But really, step 2 is making sure that you understand and identify all of the underlying elements of each funding source. That can include understanding, for example, your local economy. For those attending who are local units of government, that might be, is our local economy identifying factors that would lead us to expect a steady increase in our property tax base? Are we seeing maybe some declining revenues in that area? And from a not-for-profit angle, donations, charitable donations that your organization receives, could that be an indicator that those might be remaining steady, perhaps increasing or decreasing? That would be an example of underlying elements that you want to make sure that you evaluate effectively. And then third, once you evaluate all of that and have a good understanding of your funding streams, Take the time to assess the level of uncertainty for each funding source. Really wrap your arms around the overall picture and identify your areas of risk, which then will turn into your areas of focus. Erin, moving on to the next slide. So certainly, in addition to what we just talked about with funding streams, we want to make sure that we stay on top of what might be some challenges at the federal and state levels. We've recently experienced situations that created backlogs at those levels of government. There was some staffing layoffs and hiring freezes and so on at those levels that impacted us locally. And we want to make sure that if that type of thing happens again, that we're prepared to react to that and handle those situations. So you can see we have 3 bullet points on this slide that can be hopefully helpful tips for you. So whenever possible, make sure you build relationships locally and strengthen your ties with your local representatives and those state level agency counterparts to reduce dependence where you can, if possible. And even if you can't end up reducing dependence, at least stay informed on all of those factors that will be important for you to understand in terms of when am I going to receive my payments? Will my funding be cut? That way you can react in a proactive manner. Also, we want to make sure that we want to be able to control whatever we can internally. And that's what the second bullet point is alluding to, is that what can we do internally to make sure our processes are streamlined and centralized, making sure that we're capturing our costs, filling out all of our reimbursement forms, and making sure our reporting mechanisms internally are intact, functioning properly and efficiently so we don't cause any delays internally. Last but not least, advocate for clarity. By that bullet point, really what we're getting at is making sure you keep in contact with your those granting agencies, your representatives that you deal with regularly, to make sure you have a clear understanding of the challenges that they're facing and when we might be able to, for example, be able to expect our payments to come in. Is there indeed going to be cuts? And just making sure you're staying on top of those important issues. Next slide. So knowing where you stand with precision. In times of uncertainty, this is more important than ever, but I would suggest that knowing where you stand is always a normal part of fiscal governance and something that you want to pay attention to just on a day-to-day basis. One thing we like to evaluate is, are you running a structural deficit within your organization? It's important to evaluate that when you're looking at your financial reports. Make sure you analyze them and ask questions such as, your ongoing expenditure growth, does that consistently exceed your ongoing revenue growth year after year? Operationally, do you essentially run a deficit? And if you are, that's something that you would want to identify as a risk factor that you want to take a closer look at within your organization. Are you using one-time revenues to balance your operating budget? Are you consistently dipping into revenues to fund your operations or using one-time grants? If you are, that would be something else that you want to look at closely to make sure that you aren't getting yourself into what potentially could be a negative or deficit situation. And then the third bullet point, are your costs over time growing faster than what your revenues can support? Are your expenditures outpacing your revenues? And that lends itself to more of a longer term perspective type thinking. Speaking of longer term, that transitions into the next point. We really recommend for each organization to build a long-term budget model. If you haven't already done so, that's something that you really should consider prioritizing. It helps you with transparency, with clarity, with your ability to pivot and make decisions proactively rather than reactively. A credible long-range financial forecast helps you identify if you do have those fiscal imbalances before they become unmanageable, and can be a great indicator of whether or not your organization is really on that sustainable fiscal path. And as the slide indicates, oftentimes these types of steps, these types of evaluations can take a backseat to day-to-day governance. And why does that happen? These are important things to consider, important, evaluations to make within your organization. But really, like we've talked about time and time again throughout this presentation, I'm sure you've heard, throughout your industries, is that day-to-day workload, sometimes staffing challenges can lead to these types of more bigger picture, important things being kind of pushed to the sidelines a little bit because we're too busy, whether it be putting out fires or dealing with really urgent items that can consume our time. But it's important that we do make the time and find a way to dedicate important resources to building those long-term financial models and doing those other important evaluations. In order to build a long-term model, what we would recommend is at minimum starting with a 3-year financial model and create a template for yourself if you don't already have one that's formula driven so you can easily change your inputs. For example, I know Michelle earlier was talking about difference in with minimum wage increases over time, right? We want to make sure we build that into our long-term forecasting, cost of living adjustments, so on and so forth. And if you have the right type of model, you can easily plunk those numbers in and it will translate into the impact from a long-term perspective. I also like to, when I create a budget, a long-term budget model, make sure that I create different scenarios. And I think that's important to consider. I start with a baseline, and the baseline projection would be one that builds in some moderate growth, maybe 2 or 3% growth in your funding streams. And then 3 to 4% moderate growth with your overall expenditures. And just have that as your baseline kind of normal, if you will, place to start. Then I like to create a stress case. A stress case would be, what if I input a decrease in revenues or losing a specific grant, for example? What would that look like? What if I build in expenditures that have a larger increase over time than what my revenues do? And then from there, you can start to proactively evaluate, okay, what steps could we take? What plans should we have in place if those stressors do come to fruition? Then I like to also create a best case scenario. And that's one where revenues do keep pace with inflation and do keep pace with your expenditures overall. And just having that picture available at the fingertips as well for our analysis. Moving on to the next slide, if we could. Great. So I wanted to put in this statement here, looking for opportunity in the unexpected. It's important to remember that while we have many unknowns and uncertainty can feel overwhelming, oftentimes these tough times can lead to our best and most creative ideas and can lead to some innovation. So while we're in the thick of things and we're looking for that silver lining, I really think this is something that we can look to. Also on this slide are some ideas, some broad ideas for expense management and also efficiency opportunities to explore. One of them being data and technology improvements. Are we truly leveraging the functionality of our current softwares? If we're not, how can we? How can we become more efficient, more streamlined? Can we look at perhaps new avenues with technology and even AI in our organizations? Internally, we can also undergo process audits. Can we assess our workflow processes to identify areas where we can become more efficient? We're always charged with doing more with less, and this could be a way to make sure that we are indeed taking a hard look at all of our processes internally. And then certainly strengthening our community partnerships. Are there ways where we can cooperate and collaborate with local organizations, share resources and knowledge bases, and maybe become efficient through those steps as well? Erin, we can move on.
Thank you, Rachel. I think that's going to launch our next polling question, which asks, of those 3 ideas that Rachel just gave, which one would you like to explore first? And while people are responding to that, I'll go ahead and advance us to the next slide.
Great. Thanks, Erin. So in addition to a lot of the big picture type ideas that we were just discussing, I think it's important to remember we have to engage key members of our organization. It's so important to talk to your managers, your department heads, your staff. They're the ones who are going to have the real immersed day-to-day knowledge of your different programs and operations. It certainly encourages operational communication. I think it also strengthens the professional bonds you have with your fellow employees. I know Corrine talked a lot about employee engagement, and I think this could be an important step in that direction as well. But from a budgetary perspective, it's really important to discuss these elements with your boots on the ground folks. Things like, have there been changes in programs? Have costs come in higher than quoted? Has revenue trended as planned? Have staffing needs changed? These are important elements to discuss with your managers for those who are running those day-to-day operations for you. Your managers can also be a great resource if some budget variances do pop out when we're doing those evaluations and those analyses that we just talked about. They oftentimes are the ones that can provide you with the most clear and real information, if you will, on exactly what is causing those variances. And it's important to recognize and realizing that there's just a fount of information, and they can be really an excellent resource for you when you do have to provide reports to your board, to the public, and explain these variances to them. And remember too that significant challenges, ideas for improvement, all of those ideas can really be started from your managers and your day-to-day operators as well. So it's important to keep that in mind as you move forward with evaluating your budgets and your financial plans. Last but not least, I wanted to include this slide because it's easy to let uncertainty shake us a little bit, right? It's not always something that comes natural to us to be that confident leader in times of uncertainty. However, when we implement some of the things hopefully you've learned here today and really take that proactive step toward evaluating all of the information that you have in a transparent and clear way, what that does is prepare you and empower you to weather the uncertainty and these changes that are before us. And over time, you'll hopefully emerge even more resilient than you were before. So with that, that concludes my section of the presentation.
Thank you, Rachel. We are going to launch our final polling question.
Okay.
What was your favorite part of today's presentation? The legislative changes, going over employee engagement, I-9 compliance, or budget optimization? And while people are responding to that, I'm going to move us forward to our question and answer slide. We did have a couple of questions that were received during registration. So I'm going to be starting with those. I know we are very close on time, so if we are not able to get through all of the questions that are submitted, we will respond to you individually. So please feel free to still drop those questions in the chat. One of the questions that we received was, do you see AI as being part of future-proof processes in the future?
I'll start the conversation with the short answer of yes. I think, we're seeing AI more and more almost every day, literally. And there's a lot of great opportunities there. So I do think that there's going to be opportunities to leverage AI in the right ways. But, doing it carefully and cautiously in some ways as well. But yes, I do see it in our futures.
Michelle, I would agree. I think it's going to become part of everyone's processes, but that likely will look different for each organization. And if you're looking at putting together a strategy or policy and have some questions, feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to connect you with someone on our team. We received another question ahead of time, which is, what is the best way to ensure operations are successful? Hopefully, today's presentation has given some ideas on ways your organization can be successful. I think that's a pretty broad question. We probably could have an entire another presentation filling that. But if whoever asked that question has more specific follow-up questions after today's presentation, please feel free to reach out with those. We did have another question, Rachel, related to the long-term budget model. How long-term is long-term? What would kind of be your best practice recommendation? 12 months, 10 years, somewhere in between?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would suggest somewhere in between. I like to think of our healthy long-term financial planning model as being a minimum of 3 years. 5 years can also be a really good indicator of, long-term planning. However, I would definitely start with 3 years. I wouldn't go too far beyond 5 to 10 years. I don't know that anything beyond 10 years would be too actionable, if you will. But I believe a good starting point would be a 3-year model.
Thanks, Rachel.
Mhm.
Corrine, I think our next question might be more in your wheelhouse. What are some practical ways to address interconnected risks like compliance, people, and culture in the organization?
Oh, that's a great question. I'd say first starts with planning, second with communication. Maybe those go hand in hand. I think knocking down the silos when you have issues that interrelate or cross organizations. Too often we get into the mode where HR has an issue that really does impact. It can impact finance, it can impact illegal, it can impact the entire organization. And if you do those things in a vacuum, that's really where you end up having the majority of the risk. Don't be afraid of pulling together the right resources, pulling together team members or people from outside the department. When you have things that may cross the department or may cross the organization or may impact something outside of your own individual area. I think Rachel mentioned it. It's great opportunity. You find sometimes that you see what you see, and it's written just the way you wrote it. But what somebody may interpret and how it may impact them, you may really not have the big picture. So I recommend adding people to your team when you're making those big decisions that capture those other areas. You find that you can get a really good product out of it. So get away from the silos and reach out to other areas really to position yourself to be successful.
Thank you, Corrine. I think that's a great note for us to wrap up on. So